Hello, my dear colleagues. My name is Robert Latypov. I am head of Perm chapter of the Memorial Society. I speak about memory of the Soviet state terror, regional specific on the example of Perm region. Unfortunately, I don't speak English very well, and asked my wife Tatiana to speaking on this text. I hope uh, it's very interesting, and we can have good discussion. Yes. Thank you.
Memory of the Soviet state terror, regional specific, on the example of Perm region. To begin with, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak here. I represent an NGO which is a part of a large coalition known as the International Memorial Society. The aim of this society is preserving the memory of state terror in the Soviet times and human rights defense in the present-day Russia. At present, the International Memorial Society is having a hard time. We are being opposed by the state. The state prosecutes activists on false grounds, searches their offices and homes, and makes them pay enormous fines for their unwillingness to mark all their publications as foreign agents. So, when we are invited to speak at such meetings as this one, we take it as a sign of your academic and civil solidarity. I thank you for that. The topic I want to speak on today is very large, so I will give you just a brief overview of the situation and my own opinion. For an outsider, there is a certain paradox with the memory of the Stalin period in Russia today. On the one hand, most people know that millions of innocent people fell victim to political terror. On the other hand, neither the state nor most of the population seem to want to give a critical evaluation to the events. They are not interested in disclosing all the facts or in dropping the myth of the glorious heroic past. Most people recognize the fact that mass repressions took place. However, there are ongoing arguments about their scale, their reasonableness, and the measure of harm they cause to the country. Assessments range from repressions being a necessary and unavoidable measure to there being a global catastrophe comparable to the Holocaust or the Second World War. All these factors contribute to current shape of the culture of memory in Russia, making it very complex and full of contradictions. Besides, the situation is not the same in different regions of the country. I will outline its most significant features. Firstly, this memory is full of controversy, and it is not becoming more consolidated with time. Actually, it is getting even more controversial. It is a battlefield between two active political forces, the pro-Stalinists and the anti-Stalinists. This is a war of memory between the Memorial Society and different nationalistic and patriotic movements, between hundreds of memorials to the victims of terror and numerous attempts to commemorate Joseph Stalin. Another important field of memory battle is the Second World War. Russian authorities are heavily exploiting the myth of the Great Victory, which is replacing the actual memory of the war. This myth often leads to the justification of mass repressions, explaining them by the need to prepare the USSR for the war. the tough conditions in the country and the absence of alternatives. Obviously, the political situation in Russia, with the elimination of constitutional rights and freedoms, the growing cult of the state authorities, the spread of anti-liberal and anti-Western sentiment, the aggression against Ukraine, and the general militarization of the public consciousness, all these factors contribute to and reinforce the pro-Stalin trend. According to a survey made in 2019, conducted by the Levada Center, about half of younger Russians either know nothing about political repressions or think that they were justified. This number has been growing over the past decades, which is very sad, of course. The second important feature of memory culture in Russia is the position of the state. The authorities are sending a very mixed message on whether this field is officially approved or frowned upon. On the one hand, there is a law on the rehabilitation of victims of terror and the official admission of guilt of the Soviet state. In 2015, a concept of the state policy for the commemoration of victims of political repression was adopted, and a year later, a monument to those victims was built. President Putin has often said that attempts to justify terror and to introduce similar governing methods are unacceptable. In Perm region, there is a relatively effective committee for the restoration of rights of rehabilitated victims, which organizes various events and programs. At the same time, there are many examples of a totally opposite attitude of the state. For example, the Ministry of Culture is supporting the creation of a Stalin museum in Rzhev. City councils permit and support the building of monuments to Stalin. Criminal cases are brought against independent researchers. The most well-known criminal case is one against Yuri Dmitriev, a historian who researched the mass grave sites in Sandermoch in Karelia. The accusation is absurd, but he has been in prison for 3 years. In my native Perm region, the officials have taken over the Memorial Museum for the History of Political Repression, ousting its independent leaders and founders. This museum is unique in its kind, a restored Gulag prison which carried out a lot of research and outreach projects. After the takeover, though, the museum is still functioning, but it has lost its fame and significance and has become dull and impersonal. Another example is my own experience. A year ago, my colleagues and I organized an international research expedition to the village of Goleshor in the north of Perm region. This was where large groups of exiled Poles and Lithuanians were deported in the 1930s and 1940s. We've been organizing similar expeditions to the locations of former Gulag camps and special settlements for 20 years to collect oral history from local residents and put up memorial signs. Quite unexpectedly, our group was detained by the police and FSB officers, allegedly for cutting trees at the local cemetery. After questioning, which lasted for hours, we were allowed to go. But soon officials ordered us to pay huge fines and initiated criminal cases. They searched our office and my own apartment, took our documents and computers. I had to leave Russia for a while, for fear of being arrested. All this caused an international scandal, and a public campaign was initiated in our support. There followed numerous court hearings. All fines in criminal cases were considered unlawful and cancelled, except for one which we lost and had to pay. All these examples demonstrate that the attitude of the Russian federal and regional authorities to the history of terror and the research in this field is quite unclear. It is not surprising that many people in Russia still think that this work is almost forbidden and dangerous. A third important feature of the memory about the Great Terror is that it is one-sided and incomplete. Yes, in theory, people are aware that there used to be mass repressions in the country at some period. They may be able to name some events, places, or victims, for instance, their own relatives, but they have absolutely no idea of the scale of this phenomenon and this huge apparatus in the country. For most Russians, the Great Terror and Gulag is something that they saw in films or read about in books. This is the best case scenario, actually. Usually, the idea of the period consists of a pile of myths, and the lack of factual information is compensated by associations, phobias, and personal impressions. Therefore, the elevation of our past is mostly emotional and depends largely on individual moral principles and ideas. Besides, the memory of the Great Terror focuses mostly on the victims and not on those who organized the repressions. The state and the state officials, the actual criminals, remain outside this memory. Most of my compatriots see the political repression period as a sort of a natural disaster or an epidemic, giving no thought to the responsibility of the state for its crimes. In my opinion, this is the most important peculiarity of the memory of the Great Terror. This memory is incomplete and one-sided. The public consciousness more or less accepts the idea of remembering the victims, but it rejects the idea of remembering the actual crimes and actual criminals. This incomplete memory cannot become the basis for critical reflection and open disclosure of the crimes. Finally, although the topic of political repression concerns the whole nation, only a few people are involved in shaping the collective memory of the period. I have to admit that conservative, pro-Stalinist views and ideas are featured in mass media more and more often. They are becoming more and more categorical. The pro-Stalin interpretation of history seems to prevail in the mass culture. The topic of the Great Terror is practically not covered in school history books. In most Russian museums, this topic is secondary and unconnected with the general national historical narrative. However, there are some attempts to reverse the tide. Firstly, I mean academic research. New books written by academics on the history of Stalinism deeply research the key aspects of the history of terror, describe facts and events, provide historical analysis, formulate concepts, and organize academic discussions. Secondly, the Memorial Society and several other organizations based on declassified archives and copious academic research have been able to disclose a large number of places directly associated with the history of Stalin terror. To illustrate this, I would like to show you the preliminary results of our project on making the online Gulag map in Perm region. This map is based on archive NKVD documents and is already exceeding the expectations of its creators in terms of the scale and number of penitentiary institutions. The map includes prisons, camps, special settlements, and penal colonies. At present, it provides a description for over 1,700 institutions. This is only in Perm region, which was even not a major territory in the Gulag archipelago. The publication of this online resource contributes to raising the awareness of the scale and the economic foundations of the totalitarian society. However, as I have already said, a conservative interpretation of history is still prevailing in the public consciousness. This is explained by the active interference by state institutions and their pet mass media, and to a large extent by the fact that the progressive academic community and NGOs have very limited opportunities to change the situation. Their work is always at risk. The major obstacle for changing the situation, in my opinion, is the absence of a clear legal assessment of the political terror as a series of conscious and continuous crimes of the state against its population. If there was such an assessment, this could resolve the existing controversy and ambiguity and help make the memory of the 20th century more complete. What we need to do is to continue our outreach activities and try to overcome the myths in the public consciousness. We see it as our task to tell the people about the Soviet model of power, the ideological basis of the events, the repressive apparatus, and the day-to-day lives of ordinary Soviet people. It is important for us that the victims of repressions do not look as impersonal statistics. We want them to be represented as individuals. This is the aim of the Perm commemoration days and the civil seasons, a series of public lectures, presentations, performances, concerts and exhibitions. All these events are united by the reflection of the events of the Russian history of the 20th century, mostly the history of political repression. The target audience is the younger generation. This year, we will be holding the civil seasons in Perm for the 4th time. Our aim is to make Russian people realize that the history of terror is an important part of the national memory, and that it is necessary to start the long and consistent process of working with our national trauma. We need to understand that it is necessary to accept our difficult past and take responsibility for it. This way, we can build a moral obstacle that can stop state terror from repeating in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank
That
you
is
very
all
much.
for us.